Hey everyone, welcome to Thinking Christian. I'm here with Dr. Gregg Quiggle. My name's James Spencer, your host, and we're going to be talking a little bit today about just some of the things that Gregg Quiggle's got going on. Gregg and I have known each other since I was dean at Moody Bible Institute, and we've stayed connected throughout the years. And we recently had a project together, a book called A Praying People that was recently published by Stock Publishers. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the essay that he contributed to that volume. We're going to talk a little bit about just D.L. Moody in general. Gregg is one of the foremost experts on D.L. Moody on the planet. And then we're just going to get a little bit of insight into what a retired Moody professor's life is like on a day-to-day basis. Gregg, how you doing, man?
I'm all right. How are you, James?
I'm good. I'm good. So tell me, fill me in on what you've been doing these days. What do you got going on?
I'm finishing a book for Moody Publishers called Bread and Bibles. And it's on Mr. Moody and his understanding of the relationship between evangelism and social work, or I guess we would call it social gospel kind of things. Serving urban poor is maybe the better way to do it. Social gospel is kind of loaded. So I'm doing that. I've been doing some speaking at various churches. I've done several series on the Reformation. I did a series on the Apostles' Creed. I'm always looking for speaking gigs. And I've also tried to start a little tour company. I ran study abroad at Moody for 20 years, and
Yeah.
I missed that immensely. So myself and another fellow, Michael McDuffie, we've got something going in Germany here, boy, and really in a month, December the 1st. We've still got a few empty seats, but if you want to go, you've got to let us know now. You can contact me at my email, simply ranch812@hotmail.com. That's ranch812@hotmail.com. Maybe James will throw up a link or something at some point.
Yeah, we'll make sure we include it in the show description. So if people want to go, they can get in touch with you. I'll tell you, I was just over in Germany. I just got back. And I missed you and Mike. Last time I was over in Berlin and Wittenberg, I had my own little private tour company with Gregg and Mike, and it was fantastic. So I'd encourage anybody who's interested and you've got the time. Germany's a beautiful place, and I'm sure in Christmas time, the Christmas market there in Nuremberg would be amazing.
Yep.
And I'm, just traveling around Germany, seeing the stuff with Martin Luther and Bonhoeffer, all the World War II sites, the Berlin Wall. It was really fantastic.
Yep.
We enjoyed ourselves. But yeah, I did miss you guys.
Yeah, well, what we're focusing on in this trip is we want to do the Christmas markets. They're kind of world famous, so we'll go to several of those. But we're
Nice.
also going to look at the Holocaust.
Okay.
And Mike is an expert at that. He taught courses on that at Moody. And then I will be doing Reformation things, and we'll go from Bavaria up to Wittenberg and back. We'll see some Luther stuff. We'll see some Bonhoeffer stuff. And you remember Eric Redmond? He's a New Testament professor. He's going to
Yeah.
do sort of daily devotions on the Advent, since it is the season of Advent. So
Yeah.
we're really looking forward. Love to have a few people come. Like I said, we got a few seats left. So I'm doing that. Trying to get some things going in the summer. Trying to do a C.S. Lewis, Dwight Moody thing this summer.
Okay.
And I'm also monkeying around with a American civil religion and revivalism thing on the East Coast that would include Mr. Moody and some of the folks that were part of major revivals on the East Coast in the United States.
That sounds fantastic. Yeah, so we'll make sure we get your email up in the show notes. And so if people are interested in the Germany trip or anything else you have coming up, they can just shoot you an email, I assume. That's cool.
Yeah, that's very cool. I'd love to
Very
hear.
good. Very cool. Well, let's circle back around to the first thing you were talking about, bread and Bibles. This is based on your dissertation, correct?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So so talk a little bit about the book, talk a little bit about, what you're going to be addressing there, and maybe, if you don't want to give too much away, a couple of conclusions.
Well, the stereotype that has been established about Mr. Moody is that he is the person most responsible for turning evangelicals away from social action.
Yeah.
And I just think that's fundamentally flawed. There was a book by a sociologist named David Moberg in 1972, I believe it was. He called it the Great Reversal. And what he meant by that is evangelicalism reversed from addressing social concerns to just pure evangelism. And he was decrying, like the days when there were the abolitionists and child labor laws and orphanages and multiple social activities that evangelicals engaged in. And he said, Dwight Moody's the guy that said, no, we're not going to do that stuff. We're just going to do evangelism. And I didn't think that was right. And so I started doing some digging. And I've been digging around now for, I don't know, 10, 15 years at least. And it is true that Moody prioritized evangelism. It is absolutely false that he did nothing to serve the poor. Many of your listeners may not know that he started 2 schools in Massachusetts before Moody Bible Institute. They may be familiar with Moody Bible Institute, but the first 2 schools he started were for poor boys and girls. Yeah. They were not Bible training schools. They were educational schools, very Christian, very Bible oriented. Yeah. But they were designed to provide education for poor children. And the first one was for women, which in and of itself was incredibly progressive.
Yeah.
And one of the most interesting things about that is as it was starting, he had a burden for Native Americans. And so he said, I can't remember if she was the headmistress or what, but he said, you go out to one of these reservations and you find 12 women, young girls, that would benefit from this education and would go back and educate their own people. And she wrote, sent him a telegraph, I got 16. He said, send them, I'll find the money. So these were children of slaves. These were Native Americans. They were poor white folks. In addition to that, there's just a plethora of I guess we would call them kind of rescue mission sorts of things in the United States. In Great Britain, it's amazing. In fact, the guy that was the kind of developed the Labor Party, which is hardly right wing, was influenced by Dwight Moody. He got converted at a Moody meeting in, I believe it was Scotland, and he credited his Christianity with his concern for the poor.
Yeah.
So, the idea that he didn't care about poor people and he said, just get them saved and forget about it. I can go on for hours on this, but it's absolutely false.
Yeah. I mean, I think the first place I ran across this, I was reading a book called, I believe it was called Consuming Jesus by Paul Louis Metzger. And in there, he has just one Moody quote, as I recall, about not giving people bread.
Yes.
Right. Once you give them the bread, they're not going to listen to the gospel.
Right.
And so, you read that in isolation. And at the time, before I even did any more study on D.L. Moody or anything like that, I was kind of like, oh, that's interesting. Like, that seems a little myopic, but okay. But then as I got to know more about what D.L. Moody did, that one-liner, it's a great one-liner, which Moody had a million of them, right?
Yeah.
But it didn't really express what D.L. Moody was all about and what he was doing. I mean, even just basic stuff like early on in his career, serving as a Civil War chaplain.
Yep.
Well, that's not something that you do just to get people saved. You're not, you organized, relief efforts after the Chicago fire.
Yep.
Part of my understanding is he went to New York to raise money for the YMCA and Illinois State Street Church after the Chicago fire.
Yes.
And he didn't really want to.
That's correct.
He was just like dead tired, but he's like, well, somebody's got to fix this problem.
Right.
And so he wasn't just I don't think he was really, if you read his whole life, you don't get the impression that this is a guy who just wants to get people saved and move on. I think it's a little more complex than that. And
It's much
so,
more complex.
yeah, I think it's great you're doing the book. I've read your dissertation. So I was the other person who read your dissertation, right?
Yeah.
Dissertations are normally written just to be completely unreadable. I know mine was. I think
Yes.
my mom tried to get through it, but she was like, forget it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I've read through your dissertation. I think it's a compelling topic and an important one, because it really does. I think sometimes Moody, I see it also when we talk about the Holy Spirit. Moody's teachings about the Holy Spirit, they can
Right.
tend to get co-opted into our more contemporary discussions
Yes.
about the baptism of the Holy Spirit, or sort of the charismatic gifts and those kind of things. And I tend to think that this conversation about Moody and social work and social gospel really is just an anachronism. It's something we're importing back into him that he didn't have any trouble with.
Yeah, and that bread and Bibles quote, which shows up everywhere,
Right.
and is made as a definitive statement of who he is. First off, he was speaking to evangelists.
Mhm.
Second off, the topic was Matthew 6:33. Seek first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added on.
Right.
So okay, let's take this way out of context and say this defines the guy's life. Well, all you have to do is look at his Sunday school. I mean, he was feeding people. He was
Right.
literally going out, buying food, buying coal. And the
Right.
YMCA, they had this thing about the number of people that Moody was personally taking care of. He'd go out in the weekends and go out of the city and buy coal and food and all kinds of other, got boots for kids that didn't have shoes, all this kind of, none of that gets talked about.
But I think so much of it, maybe people don't fully understand who Moody was or how he grew up. But I mean, his experience of poverty early on
Yeah.
had to have shaped his understanding of what it looked like to help others. And I mean, I think, you talked about his Northfield work with the schools, right, for poor young men and women. But I mean, I would see that carrying through in so many other ways. Just his willingness to sacrifice himself and to give of himself,
Yep.
to help the poor. Even his work in Chicago among the sort of the ragtag kids over in the bad part of town. I don't know that he does that if he grows up in a privileged home. I think it's much more natural for him because he's poor. And so he's looking at these kids and like he's just reaching out back out to himself almost.
He knows what it's like. He grew up with nothing.
Yeah.
His father was, at least by some accounts, an alcoholic.
Mm,
He died when Moody was 4. His mom was
yeah.
8 months pregnant with twins. And they were so far in debt that the debt collectors came and stripped everything out of the house by the end of the day. His dad died in the afternoon, and his dad was a bricklayer. The only way they were able to keep his tools is they hid them. I think they hid them up in the attic. They still have them out at Northfield in the birth home. But yeah, I mean, he knew what this was like, in not just intuitively, but sort of at a gut level. He knew what it was
Yeah.
like to be hungry.
Yeah.
He knew what it was like to not be able to go to school because you had to work. He understood all these things. And so, in many ways, these were his people. Those kids were his kids. And he loved those kids.
Well, I was just doing a little research today on D.L. Moody and his preaching, right? And so I was reading through some accounts of his preaching, and one of the things that just kept coming up was he is, I'll use my word, unadorned, right? He's not a flashy dude, right? He's not slick. He's not rhetorical. He's nothing like that. But uh, to a person, it was like nobody could quite understand why this style of preaching that he was engaging in worked, because it wasn't stylish, it wasn't flashy, it wasn't particularly convincing, but at the same time, it really was. And it's just fascinating to think about it, because the vocabulary they're using for this guy is that he's just authentic and
Yes,
sincere and
yes,
earnest, and
yes.
I think that goes back to this idea of, he not only knew what it was like to be hungry physically, I think he had a deep sense of what it meant to be hungry spiritually.
Yes.
Like, he really did speak from a depth of experience in his life. He wasn't saying anything that he didn't really and truly own himself. That's the impression I get when I read the accounts of his preaching. That's what really starts to come to the surface.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways it's like Martin Luther, but in other ways it's significantly different because,
Yeah.
Luther grew up religious. Moody
Right.
really didn't. But they both shared this sense that Jesus saved them,
Yeah.
that Jesus really saved them. And I was just skimming through the chapter in our book, and I have a couple paragraphs there on his preaching, and I forget what the sentence was that he was speaking at Cambridge, but it was like some weird form of English, and you can see all these upper class English boys at Cambridge in 1880 or whatever sitting there going, who is this guy? And they laughed at him at first.
Yeah.
But they said they finally had to listen because he was so earnest. There was nothing slick about Moody.
Yeah.
He spoke at an outrageous rate of speed, about 230 words a minute, which is, just try that sometime. It's insane. Spurgeon said Moody's the only man I know who can say Mesopotamia in 2 syllables. He never said Daniel. It was always Daniel.
Yeah.
So, he did everything wrong. In fact, if you're reading on his preaching, you may not know this, but I actually wrote a chapter on his preaching for that Zondervan series on preachers.
Yeah.
And it's, what is there to model for other people here? There's not a whole lot of homiletics here.
Right.
The way he does this stuff is, but it's not about polish.
Yeah. It is. It's part and parcel of, I think, what made him work is that he just embodied this in his entire life. He was immersed in what God wanted him to do, and was, you don't want to say obsessed. Obsessed is the wrong word, but he was completely focused on it. I was compelled when I read through his letters to his family and friends and stuff like that, how easy the theological, or I even shouldn't even say theological, how easy the Christian language came to him.
Yeah.
How easy it was for him just to talk in terms of having faith in God, of what to do in this situation, of how, and he would just weave it into his everyday conversations. It isn't exactly like, the difference, again, going back to Martin Luther. I mean, Luther was trained. I mean,
Right.
he was a scholar in his own right. Moody wasn't. But he was immersed in it in a way that I think a lot of us aren't.
Yeah. He knew his English Bible,
Yeah.
and he, read that thing cover to cover all the time, and that
Yeah.
marked him.
Yeah.
But yes, he was, my favorite in terms of his writing was early days. He's writing back to his mom, I think it is. And he's trying to write in this letter some way the psalmist says. And he spells psalmist Saimest, samest, and then says is SAIS. So, nobody, and the funny thing is the impact he has in
Right.
England. Now, you can get it in the United States because there isn't this aristocracy kind of thing.
Right.
The fact that he can go over to England and, numbers of the aristocracy are moved by him.
Yeah.
Lord Shaftesbury, and numbers of Overton, multiples of these guys who were sophisticated and well educated. Even Spurgeon. I mean, Spurgeon as a young man is reading Pilgrim's Progress. Moody as a young man is, pulling pranks at school. He ain't reading anything. He's
Yeah.
creating phony meetings for temperance
Yeah, I'll say, Shaftesbury is the guy that I was really I read through a lot of his stuff today on Moody, and one of the things I found interesting is, he's almost lamenting Moody coming over, in the sense he's just like, we're planning on like having a preacher's college. We're sitting here, we're trying to figure out how do we train up the next generation of preachers? What does this look like to formalize this thing? And now here comes this guy.
Yeah.
And look at this guy. Like,
Yep.
I mean, basically just lays into it and is like, he's doing this wrong, he's doing this wrong, he doesn't do any of this, he doesn't do any of that.
Yep.
But at the end of the day, he's like, and yet the clergy, the laity, the brick, everybody is recognizing the power that this guy is bringing to the pulpit, even though he's doing every single thing wrong. We would never teach anyone to do any single thing that he's doing.
Yeah.
And you just read that and you're like, this is amazing.
Yeah.
It's this guy who actually has it down to a science, or is trying to, and just can't figure Moody out. And I think the way he phrased it, he just said, God sometimes uses the foolish things. And I don't think he was calling Moody a fool, but the point was, look, he's completely unadorned. He isn't doing anything that we think should get done. This is just the power of God working through the guy.
Well, that, and the other thing is, Moody, I mean, if you made the mistake of introducing him as Reverend Moody, he would hop on you. No, I'm not. I'm plain old Mr. Moody, a Sunday school teacher from Chicago. There were no airs about him.
Yeah.
He wouldn't tolerate that stuff.
Yeah.
He was no respecter of persons.
Yeah.
And he took that very seriously. And again, it's one thing if people are disrespecting you because they're trying to climb their way up.
Yeah.
This guy, he has no agenda. He has no agenda at all. It's not a power agenda.
Yeah.
He starts stuff and then he gets out of the way. And the other thing he does, and I used to say this all the time at Moody, you probably heard me. Moody he'd say, find the thing that needs to be done that nobody else wants to do, and do that.
Yeah.
That was the Sunday school. He tried to do regular ministry, and he was bringing these kids to church, and it was a disaster. So, hey, nobody cares to go to the slums. I'll just go there myself and do it.
Well, I remember interviewing David Powell before he passed. David Powell, for those of you who don't know, was D.L. Moody's great grandson. And so I don't think he ever knew Moody directly, but he was really steeped in who D.L. was, and was actually the one who started the D.L. Moody Center's digital archive project. But anyway, when I asked him, I said, where do you think D.L. Moody would be today? He just said he would go wherever he saw the Spirit moving. Yeah. And I love that answer. It's like, he's not still going to maybe be pounding out evangelism. He's not going to be necessarily publishing books. He would have gone wherever he felt he could make the biggest impact in the kingdom. And that is always where the Spirit is moving. And so it was a simple answer, but I loved it.
Well, he was also strategic in this sense. You and I have been to you've been to Northfield away a lot more than I have, but
yeah.
I mean, unless you're an urban wonk, there's no way anybody would want to live in Chicago instead of Northfield. It's like, would you rather live in a postcard or live in a,
right, a jungle?
Right.
Yeah.
And Moody wasn't in Chicago he didn't even, I don't even think he really liked it very much.
Right. He wasn't there for an extremely long time, even though that's sort of where everybody locates him.
And that's where but he said water runs downhill, and the big hills in our country are the cities. So we have to target the cities. So there was a strategicness. So, yes, he would go where the Spirit was moving, but it wasn't insignificant that he chose Chicago either. He didn't choose New York. He didn't choose Boston.
Right.
Donald Miller wrote a great book called Chicago City of the Century. The city in America in the late 19th century was Chicago. Chicago was about 100 people in 1837. By 1899, it's 1.9 million.
Yeah.
And it's the fifth largest city in the world. No place is growing like Chicago. That
Yeah.
was the place to be. And so that's where he pitched his tent.
When I found it interesting, I was doing some research on that early American history, is that Boston was having a hard time holding on
Yep.
to the immigrants that were coming over because they're all headed west and many of them to Chicago. And
Mm-hmm.
so what you end up with is you end up Boston being basically a sieve, right? It's still a big city. It's not,
Right.
a slouch or anything like that, but it's not growing in the way that Chicago was growing. It was more like a way stop on the way to a destination as opposed to a destination itself, which is odd to think about.
Yes.
But I mean, yeah, it makes sense that he would leave Boston, and not because he was uncomfortable there, but because the growth in Chicago, I mean, he did have business interests at that point. He was still trying to pursue, his career as a shoe salesman and was doing quite a good job at that. So, I mean, going to greener pastures where things are growing and expanding exponentially made a lot of sense. The fact that he got caught up in the Civil War, I think, is quite fascinating.
Yes.
It doesn't seem, and maybe I'm wrong about this, maybe correct me, but it doesn't seem like he moved toward Chicago to get involved with the Civil War.
No.
Feels like he moved toward Chicago for other reasons and then ended up getting involved in the Civil War. Am I correct about that?
Yeah, I think he moved to Chicago because Chicago was the place for a young man to make his fortune.
Yeah.
Boston was established. New York was tougher, but Chicago was, just those
Right.
population figures I gave you. If a population is
Yeah.
growing like that, how much business opportunity is there? It's
Yeah.
extraordinary.
Yeah.
So it was like a gold rush to go to Chicago. Every young man and his brother with a business idea, that was a place to go.
Yeah.
So he goes there, and then the Civil War breaks out while he's there. Now, it is fair to say, number one, he was a Republican, that predates the Civil War. And number
Right.
two, he was involved in abolitionist stuff. There's that famous story of him being
Right.
part of that group that's protesting the return of an African American
Right.
who was a fugitive slave.
In
Uh,
Boston, correct? That was,
yeah,
yeah.
and
Yeah.
and he went to hear Garrison and those guys speak, so he heard all the
Yeah.
famous abolitionists, and he was a staunch abolitionist, a pro-Lincoln guy.
Yeah.
So that's where his sympathy lies. But yeah, the Civil War, Chicago was accidental to his involvement in the Civil War.
Yeah. That's good. That was my reading of it, is that he wasn't really attempting that. The YMCA was probably a little more intentional because he was involved there in Boston and then in Chicago.
Yes.
Yeah, the Civil War just seems like such an odd blip on his trajectory, but
Yes.
obviously really formative and important. But yeah, it never really felt like he intentionally chose that, in the sense that he's going to move toward it.
Well, his
So,
his his connection with the Civil War comes through the Y,
okay.
because the U.S. Christian Commission, which he served with, was an extension of the YMCA.
Okay.
So when the war broke out, the Y said, these guys are going to need what we would today call chaplains.
Yeah.
And so he volunteered. And again, I think that's a case of Moody being strategic.
Yeah.
I need to be where people are and where they're going to be concerned about their souls. And besides that, these people need physical help. Who's going to carry the wounded? Who's going to do all this bury the dead? He did a lot
Yeah.
of that kind of stuff.
Yeah. It's no wonder that he was burnt out pretty quickly after the Civil War, going into his early ministry after he and Emma got married there. It's no wonder that he was burnt out. I mean, you just think about the fatigue that people have had post-COVID, right? And I mean, we basically just stayed in our houses. The Civil War was a different sort of exhaustion, I'm quite sure. And so for this guy he squeezed a lot of life into 66 years, right? Like and it's like after the Civil War, he just had to feel beyond fatigued.
Yeah, well, the total casualties for the United States in World War II were about 400,000.
Yeah.
Civil War, there's 800,000. The total population of the United States was about 29 million. So if we did it per capita, it'd be somewhere around, I'm going to lose the number, 3, 4, 5 million dead.
Yeah.
Can you imagine the United States being involved in a war with 3, 4, 5 million people dead? We haven't even included the wounded yet.
Right.
The state of Alabama, for years, its largest expenditure was artificial limbs.
No kidding. Huh.
No kidding.
Wow.
And when you look at what happened to the infrastructure in the South,
Yeah.
um,
Oh, just, yeah, totally brutalized.
brutal. And Moody was at Shiloh, and Shiloh was no joke.
Yeah.
Shiloh was one of the early bloody battles, and he saw it.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure, maybe the Pacific in World War II, but the degree of death, the amount of casualties is just stunning.
Yeah.
Just stunning. I mean, Pickett's charges, 12,000 guys start across the field, 6,000 come back. I mean, that's just stunning.
Yeah.
What's there, 2,500 at D-Day?
Right.
Uh,
Right. And yeah, it was just, it had to have been a brutal time, and his ministry being involved in that, for one, but then going back out into what had to have been a very divided country post Civil War. I mean, there was just no easy time of this guy's life. Right. I mean,
that,
you think,
yeah.
like, when does this guy ever find peace? Right. Like, not peace in Jesus, but just, a day of rest where something crazy isn't going on. They really seem to be few and far between. He was involved in a very tumultuous time period in the United States.
I think at the end of the Civil War, he's close to what we would call a nervous breakdown, both he
Yeah.
and his wife.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people don't know, but he made a trip in 1867 to England.
Yeah.
Not as a preaching trip, a getaway trip.
Yeah.
And I think that had significant impact on how his ministry took shape in the future. First place he goes is to hear Spurgeon.
Right.
And Spurgeon cleans his schedule out for a couple of days to spend time with Moody. And then he's hanging out with the Plymouth Brethren, and that's where he gets introduced to premillennialism. He goes to see George Mueller, the Mildmay conferences, which are kind of like Northfield. There's a lot of stuff that's happened in 1867, 1868 with Moody in terms of observing, just resting and observing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think that's a critical period.
Yeah, I tend to agree. And what I love about his story is, even when he comes back from that trip, I mean, I think he's got some more energy to him, right? But I recall, I think it was Major Whittle, who was one of Moody's buddies, was writing, and he was trying to construct Farwell Hall, if I recall. And he basically said, Moody's just throwing himself all into Farwell Hall, and he's killing himself.
Yeah.
Like, so he's back from this trip, and he's just back into everything, that he was doing, and he's just burning himself out again. And then he has that experience with the what was the Methodist women,
Yeah.
who are praying that he'd be filled with the Holy Spirit, and eventually, has to find that empowerment for mission.
Yeah, that's the New York experience. And,
Yeah.
was it a Pentecostal experience? Yada, yada, yada. I think I think his view of the Holy Spirit reflected what was already in England. It's called a Keswick movement.
Okay.
And really, they talk about higher living. And so when they talk about Holy Spirit baptism, they're talking about a filling that provides what Moody would call power for service. So when he talks about the Methodist women, what he says is, my ministry became much more fruitful after this experience.
Yeah.
But it's not something that's important for him. It's something that's important in terms of, for lack of a better term, energizing his ministry activity. And when you
Yeah.
mix that with what he learned in 1867 in England,
Yeah.
then I think what spins out is fairly predictable.
Yeah.
He does precisely what he saw.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what did he learn from Spurgeon? Well, Spurgeon used to walk around. There's, I forget, 1 or 2 days a week, he'd take his Bible and he'd fill his pocket with money. And he'd bang doors. And if they didn't know the Lord, he'd share the gospel. And if they didn't have anything to eat, he gave them money.
Hmm.
I mean, it was that simple. And
Yeah.
and I think that's the way Moody operated.
Yeah. I know that was a big influence on him. I mean, Spurgeon, we have letters and stuff from Spurgeon to Moody in the archives and those kind of things. And so they did keep up even after the trip.
Yep.
Huge influence on him.
Yes.
Well, let's we've kind of scoped out Moody's early life. Let's talk a little bit about the role of prayer in Moody's life. So let's get into your chapter that we have in A Praying People. Again, this is a book that myself and Ashish Varma edited. He was also a professor at Moody. We had several people write essays on prayer, not specific necessarily to D.L. Moody, but we do have a couple essays in here on D.L. Moody and D.L. Moody's prayer life. And Gregg wrote one of them. And so, yeah, talk to us a little bit about the significance of prayer for D.L. Moody, and how it really operates within his ministry.
Yeah, I think Moody's conception of prayer was, to get back to 1867. I think George Mueller played a significant role in Moody's understanding of prayer. I think the experience with the Methodist women played a critical role. He was also involved with a woman from a Baptist church in Chicago, Mother Phillips, who was a prayer warrior. But I think the place it really started for Moody is as a boy with his mother.
Hmm.
His mother is trying to raise this family, trying to keep them together. And she has a Bible, and I can't remember the text. I think it's Jeremiah, about the place of widows in the heart of God. And he would say, my mother, when she couldn't take it anymore, I could hear her praying and weeping to God and just pouring out her soul to God. And I think that marked him. I think that caused him to turn to God when things started to get out of control.
Mhm.
And then what he saw with men of prayer. And then as he begins to engage in prayer, then what you see is he develops almost a theology of prayer. But given that it's Moody, it's not ethereal, it's practical. Okay.
Yeah.
So, and that's that. Um, he lays out a practice: adoration, confession.
Hmm.
And the two things that struck me, James, as I walked through that is, number one, he has this notion of restitution,
Yeah.
which is really, you don't hear that much. You don't hear restitution as part of prayer. And he works off
Right.
of the, was it Zacchaeus, I think.
Yeah. Zacchaeus. Hmm.
And, what does Zacchaeus do? Well, he goes back and pays back the money he stole.
That's right.
And so this idea that your relationship with God is a function of your making restitution to those whom you have hurt, to the extent that you can, and the impact that has on prayer, I think is really unique and really worth thinking about. The second
Yeah.
thing that I found really fascinating is, and I found this comforting, Moody didn't have much time for long prayers.
Yeah.
He said, the prayers in the Bible are short. And there's that famous story where he's on the boat, the Spree, and they're sinking,
Yeah. Yeah.
having a prayer meeting, and Moody prays, and okay. And then he starts doing other stuff, and they're like, what are you doing? And he just looked at him and said, I'm all prayed out. You know, um, and
Yeah,
I think now this is a reflection of his personality as well. I
sure.
mean, look, the guy did everything fast. But I think there's something to the notion that too often we make prayer something that must be 4 hours and on your knees, and if you're not praying 4 hours, it's no good.
Right.
um, I think Moody spent the day praying,
Mm,
and it
yeah.
would be things like, okay, Lord, help me now, or give me a soul, or help
Yeah.
me help this family, and a kind of a conversational kind of thing. And I
Yeah.
think there's something to that. He is right. Most of the prayers in the Bible are very short. The Lord's Prayer isn't long.
Right.
Um, so I think those things really struck me, James, as I worked it through.
Yeah. I mean, I love, prevailing prayer. You hear that title, that part of the title, and you think you're going to read a book about prayer. What you really end up reading about are, what the full title says, prevailing prayer, what hinders it.
Right.
And then you go through this sort of, the way I think of it is this constellation of practices. And it's like prayer isn't going to work if you've got these sort of things all around it. And just my sense of his work overall is that what he's trying to get people to do, the way I would sort of phrase it in my own language, is he wants Christians to live life on God's terms as opposed to their own.
Yeah.
And a big part of doing that is things like confession and restitution and those kind of things. And so if you're trying to live your life on your own terms and you're trying to pray, you're obviously not going to be praying that God's will be done in your life. You're actively opposing God's will in your life. And so you have to course correct and sort of align these practices in the right configuration if you want want your prayer not to be hindered. And
Yeah.
so that sense of prevailing prayer, what hinders it? I've always loved the title because it's like you pick it up and you're going, oh, it's a prayer book. It's not a prayer book. It's a book about what hinders prayer. And I think you have to make sort of the logical leaps after that to kind of
Yeah.
figure out what he's really doing. But I think what he's doing is really profound.
Yeah. And I also think he's right that people are hindered because they feel like they have to pray a long time.
Agreed. Yeah.
Um, I've known several people, and you'll walk up to them and say, will you pray for me for this? And they will just stop right then and pray.
Hmm.
Because, we all say, yeah, I'll pray for you about that. And how many of us actually do it?
Right. Right.
But, I've always thought, well, that's kind of the way yeah, I'll pray for you right now. I can,
Yeah.
I can take 10 seconds and say something to God at this point.
Right.
I don't have to wait till my designated quiet time where I'm on my knees for 4 hours. Um, and I think that flows from being right with God.
Yeah. Yeah. It get You get the sense that Moody was just very in touch. And I don't mean that in some sort of weird ethereal way, right? But he just sort of viewed the world as God being active and present within it.
Yes.
And so if you really do start to view the world that way, short little prayers, I mean, you go to like Matthew 6, right? What does Jesus say? Don't pray like the Gentiles, piling up words. Right. And so he's not telling the disciples just to be short. He's telling them, listen, I don't, you know me, I know you. There's no reason for you just to throw all the pasta at the fridge and see what sticks. You know what sticks. So just throw that, you know. And I think D.L. Moody just really had a good sense of what stuck. That if you're aligned with God's will, if you were actively engaging him on his terms, that prayer got easier.
Yeah.
Which, what a great lesson for us.
Yeah. And it was conversational.
Yeah. Very cool, man.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
anything else? I mean, we're getting to the end here. So, if you had to leave the audience with one thing about Mr. Moody that they should know and really take to heart, right? Like, what would it be?
Um, I was thinking about this because I'm writing the conclusion now for this book, and
Mm,
I can't remember where it is. I think it's in Hebrews. So a little verse that says, Elijah was a man just like us, and he prayed, and the heavens opened. I'm working without it.
yeah, yeah,
I think sometimes we turn these people into things, people they aren't.
yeah,
Uh, Moody was a flawed person. He made mistakes. Um, we don't have time, but you and I have talked significantly about how he handled some of the racial questions of his day.
yeah.
And I,
Absolutely.
in my world, that was a massive failure, but that puts him in great company. Um, the last
Right.
time I checked, I used to tell students at Moody, the great thing about the Bible is everybody goofs up except Jesus. That's kind of the point, isn't it?
Right.
So, so I think there is here's a guy that came from nothing, no education, limited skill set, incredibly limited skill set,
Yeah.
but he gave himself to the Lord,
Yeah.
and he took advantage of opportunities as they came up. And then the other thing is, and I'll say it again, find the thing that needs to be done that nobody wants to do.
Yeah.
Churches are filled with jobs that need to be done, and nobody wants to do them because they're not glamorous.
Yeah.
Many years ago, I'm an alumnus of Wheaton, and I got a alumni magazine talking about a fellow that had died. I don't remember the guy's name, but I remember this, that for 30 years, he got up on Sunday morning at 5 o'clock and went in and turned the heat on in the church. So it'd be warm when people got there. And somebody needs to turn the heat on.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I would encourage them to just look for the opportunities that are in their life, look for the things that need to be done. Remember that Moody's a man just like us. And you don't have to be perfect or gifted. All you have to do is be willing to give yourself to the Lord.
It's a good word, man. Well, I appreciate you being with us today, and we'll have you back. We'll talk some more D.L. Moody. Like once your book comes
Great.
out,
Yeah.
we'll have you back, man. And I hope you have a great trip to Germany. Again, we'll get your email in the show notes. And so, folks, if you want to hit Germany or you want to do maybe another tour that's forthcoming, please feel free to email Dr. Quiggle. And outside of that, we will catch you on the next episode of Thinking Christian. So thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Stop.